Jack, he broke my arm. Please, I don't know what to do. Those 7 words, that's all it took. One phone call, 2 in the morning, a sister's voice so broken it didn't even sound like her anymore. And a man who hadn't cried in 15 years felt something crack open inside his chest that no fist, no blade, no highway at 100 miles an hour had ever managed to touch. If you've ever loved someone so much that their pain becomes your war, stay with me. Drop your city in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. You'll want to be here for every single word. The phone rang at 2:04 in the morning. Jack Morrison was not asleep. Men like Jack didn't sleep easy, hadn't in years. He was sitting at the kitchen table in his double wide out on Route 9, nursing a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, staring at nothing in particular, the way men do when their minds won't settle and their bodies won't quit. The ceiling fan turned slow overhead. Outside, the Arizona night was quiet, the way only desert nights can be quiet, vast and deep and indifferent, like the land itself had decided it didn't care what happened to you. His phone buzzed against the table and he looked down at the screen. Lissa. He picked it up on the second ring. Hey kid, you know what time it... The sound that came through the phone stopped him cold. It wasn't crying. Not exactly. It was something worse than crying. It was the sound a person makes when they've already cried everything out and there's nothing left but the raw, scraped hollow inside of themselves. A thin, hitching sound, like breathing, had become an effort that required conscious thought. Jack. Her voice was so small, so unlike her. Larissa Morrison was 24 years old and she laughed loud and fought hard, and never once in her life had she called anyone for help. Not once. Jack, he broke my arm. I think he broke my arm. I don't know what to do. Jack's hand tightened on the phone. His whole body went still, the way it did right before something happened. The old instinct, the thing his years on the road had carved into his nervous system. That particular stillness, like every part of him was gathering itself up. Where are you? His voice came out flat, controlled. The way he'd learned to talk when the thing inside him that he called the beast was starting to wake up. I'm at the apartment. His apartment. I can't jack. I can't drive. My arm, She made that sound again. He said if I call anyone, he'll... Lissa. He cut her off, gentle but firm. Are you safe right now? Is he there? A pause, 3 seconds that felt like 3 years. He left. He left about 20 minutes ago. He was so calm, Jack. That's the thing that scares me. He wasn't even yelling anymore. He just looked at me and said, this is what happens. And then he picked up his keys and walked out like he'd done nothing. Like I was nothing. Something moved through Jack Morrison's body that he didn't have a clean word for. Rage was part of it, but rage was too simple, too small. It was the specific kind of pain that comes from hearing someone you would die for describe the moment they were made to feel worthless, and the man responsible for it was still breathing free air somewhere out in the Arizona night. Okay, he said. Okay, Lissa, I'm coming. Don't move. Don't call him. Don't answer if he comes back. You hear me? Jack, don't do anything. I'm coming to get you, that's all. The lie came smooth and easy, and he hated himself for it, even as he said it. That's all I'm doing. Sit tight. He hung up and stood in one motion, knocking the cold coffee across the table. He didn't notice. He was already moving. His motorcycle was a 2019 Harley-Davidson Road, King Black and Chrome, and scarred in the places where 1,000 miles of hard living had left their marks. He'd ridden it through heat and rain and 3 cross-country runs with the club, and it knew the feel of him the way a good horse knows its rider responded to his weight before he even thought to steer. He had the engine turning over before he'd fully processed the decision to start it. Tyler Reed. The name was already a physical sensation in his jaw, the way his teeth wanted to press together when he thought it. Tyler Reed, who drove a $60,000 truck and worked at his daddy's real estate company, and smiled that particular kind of smile that men like Jack Morrison had learned to recognize before they could even articulate why it made their skin crawl. The smile of a man who'd never once in his life faced a consequence he couldn't pay his way out of. Tyler Reed, who had taken Jack's little sister, laughing loud, fierce Larissa, who'd raised herself half the time because their mother was gone and their father was a ghost, and had spent 18 months quietly, methodically taking pieces of her until the woman on that phone barely sounded like her anymore. He broke my arm. Jack pulled out onto Route 9 and opened the throttle. The wind hit him like a wall, and he leaned into it, the yellow center line unspooling beneath him, the desert flat and black on both sides. He wasn't thinking in full sentences. He was past that. There was a direction and a distance and a man at the end of it, and the beast, the thing he'd spent 15 years feeding, the thing that had gotten him through prison and out the other side and back on the road. The beast was very, very awake. He was doing 90 when he saw the headlights behind him. At first, he didn't register it, just another pair of lights in the night. But they were keeping pace with him, matching his speed, staying close, and after a mile, he recognized the engine sound. Knew it the way he knew his own heartbeat. Carter Webb. He swore out loud into the wind. Carter had been his road brother for 11 years, the kind of man you called when everything went sideways, because he was the only one you trusted to show up and still be standing when it was over. He was also, Jack knew, with a particular grinding frustration, the only person in the world who could talk him off a ledge. Carter pulled up alongside him, which on a two-lane desert highway at 90 miles an hour was either trust or insanity or some combination of both, and jabbed his hand sideways. Pull over. Now. Jack ignored him for 30 seconds. Carter pulled ahead, cut in front of him, and slowed down, which was insane. Which was absolutely insane. But that was Carter Webb. Jack had two choices: rear-end his best friend or stop. He stopped. They pulled off onto the gravel shoulder engines, cutting out into the sudden enormous silence of the desert night. The stars above were dense and cold and disinterested. Jack was off his bike before the kickstand was fully down, helmet in his hand, turning on Carter with something that wasn't quite a look so much as a warning. Get out of my way. Carter took his helmet off slowly. He was a big man, not quite Jack's size, but close, with a face that had seen enough that it had stopped being surprised by most things. He looked at Jack with an expression that Jack recognized and hated steady. Clear-eyed. I'm not moving. Where are you going, brother? You know where I'm going. I know where you think you're going. Carter set his helmet on his seat and crossed his arms. Walk me through what happens when you get there. Carter, walk me through it. His voice wasn't loud. That was the thing about Carter. He never raised his voice at the moments when other men would have been shouting. It made him harder to dismiss. You show up at Tyler Reed's place at 2:30 in the morning. You do what you're planning to do. Then what? What happens to Lissa? Jack's jaw was so tight it ached. He broke her arm. I know. He put his hands on my sister and broke her arm, and then walked out calm as you please, because he knew she was too scared to call anyone. The words were coming out now, through his teeth, each one separate and deliberate. He knew. That's the part you need to understand Carter. He did it knowing that's not a man losing his temper. That's a man who believes he can do whatever he wants and nobody's going to stop him. You're right, Carter said. Jack blinked. That was not the response he'd been bracing for. You're completely right, Carter repeated. He is exactly that kind of man. And that is exactly why you showing up tonight is exactly what he's counting on. The words landed oddly. Jack heard them, but they didn't quite settle. What? Carter unfolded his arms and took a step closer. Think about it. Men like Tyler Reed, they don't pick women like Lissa because they're easy targets. They pick them because they know those women have someone who loves them enough to do something stupid, something he can use. He paused. You show up tonight, best case you put Tyler in the hospital and you go back to prison. Lissa is alone. No brother, no protection, and Tyler's family's lawyers make you the story. Worst case, he let that sit for a moment. Worst case, you go away for longer than that, and Tyler gets to keep going. The silence between them stretched out long and tight. Jack looked out at the highway, back at Carter. His hands were fists at his sides, and he was breathing too hard through his nose, and the beast in his chest was pressing against the inside of his ribs like it wanted out. So I do nothing, he said. The words tasted like ash. You do the right thing, which is not nothing, but it's not this. Carter, his voice cracked slightly on the word, and he hated it, hated the sound of it, pressed his teeth together. She called me. She's 24 years old, and she's sitting alone in that apartment with a broken arm, and she called me because she didn't know what else to do. She called me. I know. I'm all she's got. I know, Jack. And Carter's voice for the first time wasn't just steady, it was quiet in a different way. Soft. The kind of soft that cost a man something. I know that. That's why I'm standing in front of you right now. Because if you go to prison, she's got nobody. And that man wins. And I am not going to let that man win. Not tonight, not ever. But you have to let me help you figure out how. Jack stood there in the dark on the shoulder of Route 9, the stars burning overhead, the desert breathing around him, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Helpless. Not the helpless of a man outgunned or outmanned. He'd been in those situations, and they'd never once broken his stride. This was different. This was the helpless of caring about someone so much that the things you knew how to do were the exact things that would hurt her most. He exhaled, a long, ragged breath. Okay, he said. Carter waited. Okay, what do we do? They went to the hospital first. Larissa was in the emergency waiting room when they arrived. She'd called a neighbor to drive her after Jack's call, which told him something about her state of mind, told him she was thinking even through the pain and the fear. She was sitting in a plastic chair with her right arm cradled against her chest, a temporary splint on it. Her face doing the thing Jack recognized from when she was a little girl and didn't want to cry in front of anyone. Jaw-tight eyes, overbright, chin at a particular angle that dared the world to comment. When she saw him walk through the door, she broke. Not loud, not dramatic, just the dam gave quietly and all at once, and she pressed her face into his shoulder when he knelt beside her and she cried the way people cry. When they've been holding it so long, the release is almost physical. He held her with one arm around her shoulders, careful, so careful of the splint, and he said nothing because there was nothing to say yet, and he'd learned long ago that the wrong words at the wrong moment were worse than silence. Carter sat down across from them and gave them space and waited. After a while, Larissa pulled back and looked at her brother. Her eyes were red and her face was swollen where Tyler had hit her, and there was a bruise forming along her cheekbone that made something in Jack's vision go briefly red. Don't, she said, reading him perfectly the way she always had. Jack, don't do that thing where you go away somewhere inside your head and I lose you. Stay here. He breathed, forced himself back into the room. I'm here. Are you sure? Because you get this look. I'm here, Lissa, I promise. She studied him for another moment, then nodded, looked down at her arm. He said it was an accident, she said. And the flatness in her voice when she said it, the exhausted rote quality of it, like she'd already said it to herself 100 times and stopped believing it halfway through, was somehow the most awful thing he had heard all night. He always says it was an accident. Tell me what happened, Jack said. Jack, not for what you think I'm going to do. He swallowed. I need to understand. I need to hear it from you. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she told him. It had started over dinner. Something Jack had said at a family barbecue 2 weeks prior. Some joke, something harmless. The exact kind of easy, comfortable sibling ribbing they'd been doing since childhood. Tyler had laughed at the time, had seemed fine, but he'd been waiting. That was the thing she'd learned. Tyler Reed always waited. He filed things away and he waited until the moment was right, and then he brought them out, shaped differently, made into weapons. He told her that night that Jack didn't respect her, that Jack talked to her like she was stupid, like she was a child, and she let him because she didn't know what it felt like to be treated with actual dignity. He'd said it calmly, reasonably, the way he always did, like he was doing her a favor by pointing it out. She'd argued back. That was what had set him off. Not loudly, not dramatically. Just her saying that's not what happened. That's not what Jack meant. And somehow the argument had escalated in that particular way. Their arguments escalated where she could never quite track how they'd gotten from A to Z, could never find the exact moment things turned just that. Suddenly they were somewhere she didn't want to be, and there was no obvious way back. He grabbed her arm. She'd pulled away. He'd grabbed it again harder, and there had been a sound, a pop sharp and clean, and then the pain, and then the stillness, the calm. This is what happens. Jack listened to all of it without moving. Carter sat across from them, saying nothing. Listening. When Larissa finished, the three of them sat in the fluorescent hum of the waiting room, and the silence pressed down. He's done this before, Jack said. Flat, not a question. Larissa pressed her lips together. Not like this. Not... Lissa, she closed her eyes. It escalates. she said quietly. It's been getting worse. I kept thinking it would stop. I kept thinking if I handled things better or said the right things or didn't. Her voice fractured and she steadied it. I kept thinking it was fixable. It's not fixable, Carter said, and his voice was so calm, so entirely without judgment, that both of them looked at him. Not by you, not by changing what you do or say or how you act. What he's doing isn't a reaction to you, Larissa. It's a pattern, and it's his pattern. It was there before you, and it'll be there after you if no one stops it. She stared at him. I know it sounds simple, Carter said. And I know it doesn't feel simple, but I need you to hear it because the story he's been telling you, the story where this is somehow connected to something you did, that's not a story about what's true. It's a story about control. Something shifted in Larissa's face. Small, barely visible, but there. He's going to say you can't prove anything, Jack said. We can help her prove it, Carter said. That's what we need to talk about. Not tonight. Tonight we get her safe and we get her arm properly set. But there are steps, real ones, and he looked at Jack, you're going to have to trust a process that feels too slow and too legal and too much like letting him off the hook. Can you do that? Jack looked at his sister, at the bruise on her face, at the splint on her arm. The beast pressed against his ribs. He pushed back. Yeah, he said roughly. Tell me what we do. It was past 5 in the morning by the time they got Larissa fully checked and her arm properly x-rayed and set in cast. A clean fracture of the radius, the ER doctor said, the kind of break consistent with the arm being twisted sharply against resistance. The doctor asked her quietly and carefully whether she wanted to speak with an advocate. Larissa looked at Jack. Jack looked at Carter. Carter nodded. Yes, Larissa said, I think I do. And watching his sister say that word, yes, small and terrified and real, Jack felt something shift in him that was harder to name than rage. It was the recognition that this moment, this particular inflection point in the long story of his family had come down not to the things he knew how to do, but to the things he had to learn. He'd spent 15 years being the beast. 15 years of knowing exactly how to handle a threat, exactly how to make sure no one put their hands on what was his. And here in the white light of an emergency room at 5 in the morning, he was understanding for the first time that the person most likely to undo everything, the person Tyler Reed was most counting on to make a mistake, was him. The thought was humbling in a way that made his chest ache. He sat down in the chair Larissa had been sitting in and put his face in his hands and breathed. After a moment, he felt a hand on his shoulder. Carter. Not saying anything, just there. I'm going to need help, Jack said into his own palms. Rough, barely audible. I know, Carter said. That's why I'm here. Outside, the Arizona sky was beginning to go gray, and at the edges, the long, black night releasing its grip on the horizon, one reluctant shade at a time. Inside the hospital, his sister was talking to an advocate. Inside his chest, something old and violent and familiar was pacing back and forth in its cage. But the cage was holding. For now, the cage was holding. And Jack Morrison, Rogue Captain, Hell's Angel, the man they called the Beast, sat in a plastic hospital chair and made a decision that went against every instinct he'd ever developed in a lifetime of fighting his way through the world. He decided to do this right. Whatever that cost him, the decision to do things right felt clean at 5 in the morning. By noon, it felt like being buried alive. Jack sat in the parking lot of the hospital for 20 minutes after Larissa was discharged, just sitting on his bike with the engine off, watching Carter load his sister into the passenger seat of Carter's truck with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something fragile. She'd barely spoken since they left the ER. The advocate had given her a folder, resources, hotlines, legal options, printed on paper in clean black font, and she'd held it in her lap the whole time like she didn't quite know what it was. Jack knew what she was doing. He'd done it himself after prison. The shutting down, the going somewhere inside yourself, where things couldn't touch you, because the alternative feeling all of it all at once was not survivable. He recognized it, and it broke his heart clean in half. His phone buzzed. A text from a club brother. Heard about Lissa. Say the word. He stared at it for a long moment. 3 words. Simple as breathing. He could say the word right now, and Tyler Reed would spend the rest of the week regretting every decision that had led him to this point, and Jack would never have to touch him personally. never have to set foot near him, could stand in a hospital parking lot with clean hands while the problem solved itself the way problems had always solved themselves in his world. He put the phone in his pocket without responding. Carter was watching him from the driver's side window. Said nothing, just watched. Jack started the engine. They took Larissa back to Jack's place because there was nowhere else her apartment was. Tyler's apartment had always been Tyler's apartment, and the thought of her going back there made Jack's eye twitch in a way he had to actively manage. She sat on his couch with a blanket someone had put around her shoulders and stared at the wall, while Carter made coffee in the kitchen, and Jack sat across from her and tried to figure out what to say to a person who'd had the floor pulled out from under them. He settled on the truth. "I almost went to his place last night," he said. Larissa looked at him slowly. "Before Carter caught up with me on the highway, I was already moving. I had a direction and I had a plan, and it wasn't—" He exhaled. "It wasn't a good plan, but it was the only one I knew." She was quiet for a moment. "What stopped you?" "Carter blocked my lane at 90 miles an hour. Something flickered in her face. Not quite a smile, but something. "That man is insane." "Yeah," Jack agreed. "He is. He's also right, which is the part I hate." Larissa pulled the blanket tighter. "Tyler would have loved it," she said softly. "If you'd shown up, he used to say things about you. When we fought, he'd say Jack was a criminal, that you were the reason I had no sense of boundaries, that being around men like you was why I thought volatility was normal." She paused. "He'd say it like he was concerned, like he was the stable one and you were the danger." Her jaw tightened. "I can't believe I let him say that to me." "Hey," Jack leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You didn't let him do anything. He was the one talking. That's on him." I didn't argue back. "You argued back last night," Jack said. "And we know how he handled that." The words came out harder than he intended, and he saw her flinch and immediately hated himself for it. "Lissa, I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "No." She shook her head. "No, you're right. I know you're right. I just—" She pressed her good hand flat against her sternum, like she was checking whether her heart was still there. "I feel so stupid. That's the thing I can't get past. I feel so unbelievably stupid." "Smartest people I know have been where you are," Carter said from the kitchen doorway. He had 3 mugs in his hands, and he crossed the room and set them down on the coffee table and sat in the chair at the corner. "That's not an accident. Men like Tyler, they're not stupid either. They find people worth the effort." Larissa looked at him. "That's a generous way of looking at it." "It's an accurate way." Carter's voice was level. "He didn't do this because you were easy. He did it because you were worth controlling. That's cold comfort, I know, but it's the truth." She picked up her coffee mug with her left hand, the unbroken arm, and held it in both hands the way you do when you need something solid to hold on to. "So what do we do?" she said. Not a question exactly, more like she was trying the sentence out, seeing how it felt to ask it. "First thing," Carter said, "is we call Rebecca Torres." Jack had heard the name once before in a context that hadn't meant much to him at the time. Rebecca Torres was a family law attorney out of Tucson, the kind of lawyer who had built a reputation not by winning the big money cases, but by winning the cases that mattered. Custody battles, protective orders, cases where one person had resources and one person had nothing but the truth. She was, Carter explained, already aware of Tyler Reed's family, because the Reed family had a history in Tucson legal circles that went back further than most people knew. "How do you know her?" Jack asked. "I did some work for her firm last year. Handyman stuff. We talked." Carter shrugged the way he always shrugged when he was understating something. "She's good, Jack. She's the kind of attorney who doesn't need you to have money. She needs you to have a case." "Do we have a case?" Carter looked at Larissa. Larissa looked at her cast. "We have a broken arm," she said quietly, "and about 8 months of things I should have reported and didn't." "Can you remember them?" Carter asked. She let out a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and something much less funny. "I remember all of them. I kept telling myself they weren't worth—" She stopped, started again. "I took pictures a few times. On my phone. I didn't know why I did it exactly. I think some part of me knew." Jack felt the hairs on his arm stand up. "You've got photos." "Some. Not all, but some." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read, something complicated living behind it, part shame, part something harder. I didn't know I was building a case. I thought I was just, I don't know, documenting, keeping a record for myself, so I'd know I wasn't crazy. The word crazy landed in the room and Jack caught Carter's eye, and he could see Carter caught it too. Tyler Reed's voice in Larissa's mouth, the particular vocabulary of a man who had spent 18 months curating her reality. "You're not crazy," Jack said. "I know that," she said, and then quieter, "Some days I know that." Carter pulled out his phone and sent a text. "I'm reaching out to Rebecca now. She'll want to meet with you, Larissa, today if possible, while everything is fresh." He looked up. "Can you do that?" Larissa looked down at her cast, at the folder from the Advocate still sitting beside her on the couch. Then she looked at her brother. "Will you come?" she asked. "Try and stop me," Jack said. Rebecca Torres was not what Jack expected, which was itself a lesson he filed away without meaning to. He'd been expecting someone soft, a professional kindness, a practiced empathy. What he got instead was a woman who shook Larissa's hand, looked at the cast, looked at the bruise, and said with a directness that cut straight through the room, "Tell me everything, start at the beginning, don't edit yourself, I'll tell you what matters and what doesn't. Your job right now is just to talk." Larissa talked for 2 hours. Jack sat beside her and listened to things he hadn't known, hadn't been told, hadn't been allowed into 18 months of a relationship that from the outside had looked difficult, but manageable, and from the inside had apparently been something else entirely. The first time Tyler had grabbed her, the time he'd locked her out of the apartment in January, and she'd sat on the stairs for 3 hours because she'd left her phone inside and didn't want to knock and set him off again. The way he spoke to her in public, never loud, never obvious, always in the register of concern or disappointment, always with enough plausible deniability that the people around them looked away. Every time she stopped clearly expecting judgment, Rebecca just said, "Keep going." Not warmly, not coldly, just with the certainty of someone who'd heard the story before and understood that the worst thing she could do right now was make Larissa feel like she had to perform her own victimhood to be believed. Jack's hands were tight on his knees the entire time. When it was over, Rebecca sat back and looked at her notes and was quiet for about 15 seconds, which felt like a long time. Then she said, "You have more than I thought you'd have. The photographs help significantly. The ER report will be central. There are 2 former girlfriends who," she paused. "I've heard things. I want to pursue that avenue. Tyler Reed is not a first-time offender. He's just never been properly cornered before. His family has money," Jack said. Not aggressively, just putting it on the table. "I know." Rebecca looked at him steadily. "His family also has a reputation to protect." "That's a double-edged thing, Mr. Morrison. Money can buy good lawyers. It can also mean a family that wants this to go away quietly, which sometimes works in our favor." She looked back at Larissa. "What I need from you, and I need you to understand this clearly because it matters, is that you do not contact Tyler. You do not respond to Tyler. If he contacts you, you document it, and you tell me immediately. You do not let your brother," a glance at Jack precise and pointed, "handle this any other way." Larissa almost smiled. "I've been trying to manage my brother for 20 years. "Manage him harder," Rebecca said, and there was the faintest warmth in it just for a moment before it was gone. "I can get you a protective order. That's step 1. Step 2 is building the full case, and that takes time. Do you understand what I'm telling you? This is going to take time, and it's going to be uncomfortable, and he is going to push back hard before it's over. Are you prepared for that?" Larissa was quiet for a moment. Then she sat up straighter. Incrementally, just a degree or 2, but Jack noticed it. "Yes," she said, "I'm prepared." The protective order came through 48 hours later. Jack heard about it when Carter called him, and he sat with the information for a while, turning it over. A piece of paper. Tyler Reed was legally required to stay away from Larissa by a piece of paper. In Jack's world, pieces of paper had never protected anyone from anything, and the gap between his understanding of how safety worked and how the legal system worked was vast and uncomfortable, and he didn't know what to do with it. He went for a ride. That was his version of thinking 2 hours on the highway alone, letting the motion work on him. By the time he got back, Carter was at his house with food from the taqueria on 6th and a name written on a napkin. "What's this?" Jack said. "His name is Dr. Alan Phillips. He works with veterans mostly, but he sees civilians. He specializes in—" Carter seemed to choose the next words carefully. "Anger, the productive management of it." Jack stared at him. "Before you say anything," Carter said. "I wasn't going to say anything. You were making the face." "I don't have a face." "Jack, you have a face." Carter put the food on the table and sat down. "You made it through last night on willpower, and you made it through the meeting with Rebecca on willpower, and you're going to run out of willpower eventually. Phillips isn't about making you soft. It's about giving you something to work with that isn't just white-knuckling it every time someone says Tyler Reed's name." Jack picked up the napkin, looked at the name, put it down again. "I went to therapy once," he said, "court mandated. The guy asked me how I felt about my father. Phillips doesn't do that." "How do you know?" "Because I've seen him myself." Carter said it flat and simple, no preamble. "After my divorce, when I was not handling things well." A pause. "He helped me figure out where my anger was actually coming from, which was not where I thought it was coming from." Jack looked at his friend. Carter met the look without blinking. "All right," Jack said finally. "I'll call him." It was not a comfortable admission, but it was honest. And in the new calculus, Jack was trying to learn the one where honesty mattered more than image. Honest was what he had to keep choosing. The first session with Dr. Phillips happened on a Thursday morning. Jack showed up 10 minutes early and sat in the parking lot for those 10 minutes running through all the reasons this was stupid. Then he went in. Phillips was older than he'd expected, late 60s, white hair, the kind of quiet stillness in a person that Jack associated with either deep peace or deep control. He shook Jack's hand and looked at him with a directness that Jack found surprisingly easier to manage than softness would have been. They sat. Phillips asked him why he was there. Jack said his sister's boyfriend broke her arm. Phillips said, "And what did you want to do about that?" "Kill him," Jack said, straight out, because if he was doing this, he was doing it honestly. Phillips nodded like that was a perfectly reasonable thing to say. "And what stopped you?" "My friend blocked my lane on the highway." "What stopped you after that?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "I looked at my sister's face," he said, "and I understood that if I went to prison again, she'd have nobody. And he'd win. And he stopped. Something was pressing up through his chest that he didn't have a clean word ready for. "I've spent my whole life making sure nobody could touch the people I love. I thought that meant being the most dangerous thing in the room. But it didn't work, did it? He touched her anyway. While I was being the most dangerous thing in some other room." His jaw tightened. "I don't know what to do with that." Phillips was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "That sounds like grief." Jack blinked. "The loss of a strategy," Phillips said. "You built an identity around a method of protection. The method failed. That's not just anger, that's grief. The two get confused a lot, especially in men who've been taught that grief isn't available to them." He leaned forward slightly. "What would it feel like to protect your sister in a way that actually worked?" Jack sat with that question. It was harder than it looked. 2 weeks went by. They were not easy weeks. Tyler Reed, apparently informed through his family's network that a protective order had been filed, went quiet in a way that made Jack more nervous. Not less. Silence from a man like that wasn't peace, it was waiting. Jack knew the particular quality of it because he'd done it himself back when he was younger and less careful. The gathering before the move. Larissa started therapy of her own, a counselor named Diana who worked out of a community health center, and had Larissa reported the uncanny ability to say true things in ways that made them feel survivable. She went every Tuesday. She came back from each session quieter and more solid, like each visit was laying down a layer of something that had been stripped away. She'd started doing yoga too. Jack didn't comment on this. It wasn't the kind of thing he knew how to comment on. But he noticed that she stood differently, took up more space in a room. He noticed because he'd been watching her shrink for a year and a half and hadn't known that was what he was seeing. One evening she came over for dinner, and while they were eating, she put down her fork and said without preamble, "I need to tell you something about Tyler that I haven't told Rebecca yet." Jack set down his fork too. Carter, who was there because Carter was always there, went very still. "There are other women," she said. Not affairs, or not just affairs. There's a woman in Scottsdale. Her name is Melissa. We've never met, but she found my Instagram 2 months ago, and she sent me a message, She stopped. I didn't respond. I was too scared. I deleted the message. But I remember her name, and I remember what she said, and I think her voice steadied. I think she's been through the same thing. I think she might talk to Rebecca. The silence at the table was the loud kind. You've been sitting on this for 2 months, Jack said carefully. I was scared he'd find out I'd talk to her. Lissa. I know, Jack. She met his eyes directly. I know. That's why I'm telling you now. That's the whole point of now. I'm telling you now because I'm not sitting on things anymore. That's over. Jack looked at his sister, at the cast on her arm, at the way she held herself, at the thing in her eyes that was returning the particular light of her that he'd watched dim over 18 months and was now painstakingly coming back, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time directed at someone who wasn't himself. Pride. Clean, simple, uncomplicated pride. Okay, he said. We call Rebecca in the morning. Carter was already reaching for his phone. And somewhere across the city, in a $60,000 truck, Tyler Reed was quiet and calculating and sure in the way that men like him are always sure that he had this under control. He did not know about Melissa in Scottsdale. He did not know what was coming. And the cage in Jack Morrison's chest held steady, not because the beast was gone, but because for the first time in his life, Jack Morrison had understood that the beast's job was not to be unleashed. Its job was to wait. Melissa Vance drove 4 hours from Scottsdale. She didn't have to. Rebecca hadn't asked her to come in person. A phone deposition would have worked fine legally, would have been easier on everyone, and Larissa had halfway expected that's how it would go. But Melissa had said in a voice that Larissa heard through Carter's speakerphone and immediately recognized not the words but the texture of the voice, the particular flatness of someone who had learned to keep their emotions at arm's length just to get through a sentence. She'd said, I want to be in the room. I've been not being in rooms for 3 years. I'm done with that. So she drove. She was 31, dark hair, practical clothes, a composure that sat on her like armor. She'd put on so many times it had started to feel like skin. She shook Rebecca's hand first, then Larissa's. And when she looked at Larissa's cast, she didn't flinch, didn't perform sympathy. She just said, right arm. Yeah, Larissa said. He did my collarbone, Melissa said. Told the ER I fell off a horse. A beat. I don't own a horse. Something passed between them in that moment, fast, wordless, the specific recognition of two people who have been translated by the same language into something smaller than themselves. Then it was gone, and they were sitting in Rebecca's conference room, and it was time to work. Rebecca had a recorder running and a yellow legal pad and the focused expression of someone who'd been waiting for exactly this moment. She looked at Melissa and said, start wherever you need to. Melissa started 3 years back. Jack sat in the corner of the room and listened. He'd asked Rebecca if he could be there not as a participant, just present. And Rebecca had asked Larissa. And Larissa had said yes, she wanted him there. So he sat with his arms on his knees and his hands loose and worked very hard at the thing Phillips had been teaching him, feeling the anger without being run by it, noticing it the way you notice weather. This is here, this is real. This does not have to become a decision. What Melissa described was not identical to Larissa's experience. It was worse in some ways and different in others, but the architecture was the same escalation pattern, the same vocabulary of concern and disappointment, the same careful isolation, the same moment when something crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. She'd left after the collarbone, had moved to Scottsdale specifically to put distance between herself and Tyler's network, Tyler's family, the entire gravitational pull of a life she'd let him build around her like a cage she'd agreed to call a home. She'd never reported it. Why not? Rebecca asked, and her voice was entirely without judgment. Melissa looked at the table for a moment. Then she looked up. Because his father plays golf with the deputy county attorney, she said. And because I didn't think anyone would believe me. And because, she stopped. Because I was ashamed, even though I knew it wasn't my fault, I was ashamed. Does that make sense? Yes, Larissa said, quietly, from across the table. Melissa looked at her. It makes complete sense, Larissa said. I had pictures on my phone, and I still almost didn't call my brother. Something in Melissa's composure shifted just slightly, just at the edges. Does it get better? She asked. And for the first time, she sounded her age or maybe younger, sounded like the person under the armor. I need someone to tell me it actually gets better because everyone says it does, but nobody says it like they really know. Larissa was quiet for some moment. Her cast was on the table. She looked at it, then at Melissa. I'm 2 weeks in, she said honestly, so I can't tell you what a year from now looks like. But I can tell you that this morning I woke up and the first thing I thought about wasn't him. She paused. That's the first time that's happened in I don't know how long. Melissa pressed her lips together, nodded once. Okay, she said. Okay, that's enough. She turned back to Rebecca and kept talking. Jack didn't say anything until they were in the parking lot. Carter was with him and Larissa was still inside finishing paperwork, and it was just the two of them in the midday heat, and Jack stood there with his hands in his pockets doing the thing he had been doing since that conversation started 3 years back inside the conference room, counting. Counting the women. Counting the years. Counting the particular accumulated weight of one man's decisions across time and geography and relationships. The quiet disaster of it, the sheer scope. He knew what he was doing, Jack said. Not loudly, almost to himself. Yeah, Carter said. I mean, I've known men who were violent. Men in the club men I grew up with. Some of them were impulsive. Some of them were mean. But this is, Jack shook his head. This is methodical. This is a man who thinks about it, who plans it, who picks his targets and builds his approach, and his voice stopped. Carter waited. Who was going to be next, Jack said. If Lissa hadn't called me, if Melissa hadn't sent that message, he was just going to keep going. That's why this matters, Carter said. What Rebecca's building. That's why it has to go through the system, Jack. Because this isn't about one broken arm. It's about a pattern, and patterns are what courts can prosecute. Jack knew this. Phillips had talked about it. Rebecca had explained it. Larissa had said it herself. He understood it intellectually with every part of his brain that operated on reason and patience and the long view. The beast didn't care about the long view. The beast was doing very simple arithmetic. One man, measurable damage, available solution. I have another session with Phillips tomorrow, Jack said. Good, Carter said. I might need to call him tonight. Carter pulled out his phone and handed it over without a word. Jack took it and dialed and left a message and handed the phone back, and they stood in the parking lot and waited for Larissa, and the Arizona sun pressed down on them, indifferent and enormous, the way it always had. Phillips called back that evening. They talked for 40 minutes. Jack sat on the back step of his house and talked into the phone while the sky went orange and then pink and then the deep bruised purple of an Arizona sunset. And Phillips mostly listened with the occasional question, the occasional redirect, the occasional silence, that was itself a kind of response. At one point, Jack said, I feel like I'm failing her by not doing anything. Phillips said, what does doing something look like to you? Handling it, the way I know how to handle things. And if you handle it that way, what happens to Larissa? She loses her brother. So handling it the way you know how is in effect a choice to prioritize your own feeling of action over her actual safety. The bluntness of it stopped Jack short. He sat with it. That's not, I don't mean it that way, he said. I know you don't mean it that way, Phillips said. But intent and effect aren't the same thing. You've spent 15 years in a world where decisiveness and force were how you demonstrated love and loyalty. I'm not dismissing that world. It has its own logic and it's kept you alive. But Larissa's situation requires a different kind of strength, not absence of action. Sustained, disciplined, strategic action in the direction that actually protects her. That's harder than what you're used to. I think you know that. Jack looked at the sky. Yeah, he said, I know that. The hardest thing a person like you can do, Phillips said, is trust a process you didn't design and can't control. That's what you're being asked to do right now, and you're doing it. That's not nothing, Jack. After he hung up, he sat on the back step for a long time. The night came in around him, warm and vast, the stars punching through, one by one. Inside, he could hear Larissa moving around in the kitchen. She'd been staying with him, sleeping in the spare room, and the sound of her presence in his house was something he hadn't realized he'd missed until it was back. She came outside after a while with 2 mugs of coffee and sat on the step beside him without asking, handed him a mug, and they sat together in the dark, the way they used to when they were kids, and the world was loud and they needed somewhere quiet. Rebecca called, Larissa said. She found a third woman. Jack looked at her. Her name is Dana. She's in Phoenix. She's already said yes. Larissa wrapped both hands around her mug carefully, the cast making her adjust. 3 of us, Jack. 3. The number landed like a stone in still water. He's going to know, Jack said. When this starts to move, he's going to feel it, and he's going to react. Rebecca says that's expected. She says that's actually when the protective order matters most, when he feels cornered. Larissa looked at him sideways. She also says that's when we need to be most careful about, she gestured vaguely in his direction. About me. About the beast, she said, not unkindly, with the ease of someone who'd been saying it her whole life, the word worn smooth between them. The beast is in therapy, he said. She laughed, a real laugh, short and surprised, and the sound of it hit him somewhere behind the sternum. He hadn't heard her laugh in so long that he'd forgotten the specific shape of it. I'm serious, he said, but he was almost smiling. I know you are. That's what's funny. She leaned into his shoulder briefly, the way she'd done when she was 7 and the world was too big. You're doing good, Jack. I need you to know I see that. He didn't trust himself to say anything, so he just put his arm around her and they sat there and drank their coffee in the dark and let the night be what it was. 3 days later, Tyler Reed showed up at Jack's house. He didn't knock. He parked his truck in the driveway, that $60,000 truck, obscenely clean, and got out and stood there like he was waiting for something. Jack saw him first through the front window, and his whole body went cold in the specific way it did before a real confrontation. Not the hot rage of that first night, something colder and more focused. He texted Carter. He's here. Then he texted Rebecca Tyler at my house. Not touching him. Recording now. He pulled up the voice recorder on his phone, hit record, and put it in his shirt pocket. Then he opened the front door. Morrison, Tyler said. He was doing the calm thing. The performance of calm, which was different from actual calm. Jack knew the difference because he'd spent 15 years around men who had used it himself. We should talk. You're in violation of a protective order, Jack said. He kept his voice level. Larissa is in this house. You need to leave. I'm not here about Larissa. Tyler's chin came up slightly. I'm here about you, about whatever you think you're doing. I'm doing exactly what the law allows me to do, Jack said, which is standing in my own doorway. She's manipulating you. The words came out smooth, rehearsed, reasonable. I know how this looks. I know what she's told you. But Larissa has a history of, stop. Jack's voice didn't rise. Didn't need to. Stop right there. Tyler stopped, not because he was intimidated, not yet, but because something in Jack's register had shifted in a way that registered even on someone as practiced in controlled situations as Tyler Reed. You drove here, Jack said, to my house where Larissa is staying, which you know because you've been watching, which is itself a problem for you legally. You drove here to tell me that my sister is lying. That's what you came to do. A pause. The fact that you felt like you needed to do that tells me Rebecca is getting close to something. So I'm going to stand here and let you talk because every word out of your mouth right now is going into a recorder in my pocket. And when you're done, you're going to get back in your truck and drive away and not come back. Because the next time you show up here, I will not be the one calling the police. Larissa will, and she will do it with the confidence of a woman who knows exactly how this ends for you. Something moved across Tyler's face, fast there and gone. Not fear exactly. The precursor to fear. The moment a controlled man realizes the board has been rearranged. You think this is over, Tyler said. Quieter now. I think it's ending, Jack said, and I think you know that. Tyler looked at him for a long moment. The truck keys were in his hand and he was squeezing them, and the knuckles were going white. And Jack tracked all of it with the same flat attention he used to track things that could hurt him. Because Tyler Reed was absolutely something that could hurt him, not physically, but in the ways that mattered now. This isn't who you are, Tyler said. Playing by rules, going through the system. A slight smile calculated. I know about your record, Morrison. I know about the club. And I know that standing in a doorway talking about protective orders is not something you're going to keep doing. You're right, Jack said. This isn't who I was. He held Tyler's gaze. But it's who I am now. And it's going to be the thing that puts you in a courtroom. Us dog. Tyler left. He drove away without another word, without the dramatic exit Jack had half expected, and the cleanness of the departure was somehow more unsettling than a scene would have been. Jack stood in the doorway until the truck was off the street, then went inside and stood in the hallway and just breathed for a moment. Larissa was standing 10 feet behind him. She'd heard everything. You recorded it, she said, every word. He said I was manipulating you. He did. She pressed her hand flat on her sternum again, that gesture he'd learned to read. Then she straightened up. Send the recording to Rebecca. Already texting her, Carter said from the kitchen. They both looked at him. I came in through the back when I got Jack's text, Carter said, perfectly calm, phone in hand. Figured you did not need the audience. Rebecca says the visit itself is a violation she's filing tomorrow. She also says, he looked at his phone reading, she says Tyler's father called her office this morning. That landed like something dropped from height. His father called her, Jack said. Wanted to discuss a settlement, a quiet one. Carter put his phone down. She told him she'd be happy to discuss it in a courtroom. Larissa made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sob. It was something in between, something that happens when relief and fury arrive at exactly the same moment and your body can't decide which one to process first. He's scared, she said, slowly, like the word was new in her mouth. He's actually scared. He's cornered, Jack said, which is when he's most dangerous. Rebecca said that. Philip said that. He looked at his sister. We don't let our guard down, not yet. She nodded. Her chin was doing that thing again, the angle she used to dare the world to comment. But this time it didn't look like defiance covering fear. It looked like something that had grown out of the fear and stood beside it and was not going anywhere. What did it feel like, she asked, standing there, talking to him like that? Jack thought about it honestly. Like every instinct I have was pointing one direction, he said, and I had to stand completely still. Like holding a door shut from the inside while something very heavy was pushing on it. She looked at him with an expression he didn't have a word for. Soft and hard at the same time. Does it get easier? She asked. He almost smiled. He recognized the question. Had heard it 40 minutes ago in a different voice in a different room. The question that keeps coming back because it's the only one that really matters. Ask me in a year, he said. She nodded. And then quietly she walked over and put her head against his chest and stood there, and he put his arms around her and held her carefully. The cast, always the cast, and the house was quiet around them, and outside the Arizona afternoon was bright and hot and indifferent and enormous. And in a conference room across the city, Rebecca Torres was on the phone with Tyler Reed's father's attorney, laying out methodically and without any particular drama, exactly what 3 women and 1 recorded confrontation and 1 broken radius in 18 months of documented escalation looked like in front of a judge. Tyler Reed's world was contracting. He just didn't know it yet. He just didn't. And Jack Morrison, the beast, the road captain, the man who'd spent 15 years being the most dangerous thing in the room, stood in his own hallway holding his sister and breathed and let the law do what he couldn't do himself. The door held. Rebecca filed the protective order violation on a Tuesday morning. By Tuesday afternoon, Tyler Reed had a new attorney. His name was Grant Holloway, and he was the kind of lawyer whose name you recognized before you recognized his face, old Tucson. Money, the kind of practice that had been operating for 4 decades in the same downtown building that had relationships with every judge on the circuit and wasn't shy about using them. When Rebecca called Jack to tell him, her voice was level in the way that meant she was choosing her words carefully. He's bringing in Holloway, she said. Jack was at his kitchen table. Carter was across from him. He put the call on speaker without asking. Is that bad? It's a message, Rebecca said. Holloway doesn't take cases he thinks he'll lose. He takes cases where he thinks the other side can be pressured into settling or backing down. His presence means the Reed family has decided to fight instead of manage quietly. A pause. It also means they're scared enough to spend serious money. So it's good, Carter said. It's complicated, Rebecca said. Holloway is going to go after credibility. That means Larissa, Melissa, Dana, all 3 of them are going to be examined very carefully for inconsistencies, prior statements, anything he can use to cast doubt. He's going to try to make this about the accusers rather than the accused. It's a standard playbook, and it's effective when people aren't prepared for it. Prepare them, Jack said. That's what the next 3 weeks are for. She paused again. I also need you prepared, Jack. Holloway will absolutely look at your record. He'll try to paint this entire situation as a personal vendetta from a man with a history of violence. He needs the jury, if this gets to a jury, to see you as the threat, not Tyler. Jack absorbed this. Next to him, Carter was very still. What do I need to do? Jack said. Keep doing exactly what you've been doing. Every therapy session documented. Every time you've chosen restraint, there's a record of that choice. Phillips has agreed to provide a professional statement about your progress if needed. A brief pause, something softening slightly in her voice. You've actually been making my job easier, not harder. Keep that up. After she hung up, Jack sat with the phone in his hand and thought about Grant Holloway and the Reed family's money and the 4 decades of relationships in Tucson, legal circles, and he felt the specific weight of a fight that was larger than anything he'd ever walked into, because in every fight he'd ever had before, size and will had been enough. This was different. This was a fight where his size and will were liabilities. They're going to drag everything up, Jack said. Not to Carter specifically, just out loud. Yeah, Carter said. The club, the record, the whole story. Yeah, Jack set the phone down. You know what the worst part is? Carter waited. They're not wrong, Jack said, about who I was. Everything they're going to say, most of it is true. I've done things, real things I can't argue with. He looked at his hands on the table. Holloway's going to walk into a courtroom with 15 years of Jack Morrison, and he's going to put it in front of a jury and say, this is the man making accusations against Tyler Reed. And some of those jurors are going to look at me and believe him. Some, Carter said. Not all. Some is enough to, Jack, Carter's voice was firm. Look at me. Jack looked up. 3 women, Carter said. Medical records, photographs, a recorded confrontation, a protective order violation, a pattern across 6 years and multiple victims. He held Jack's gaze. Holloway can put your whole life on the table. Rebecca is going to put Tyler Reed's whole life on the table. And when those 2 things sit next to each other in front of 12 people, your life and his, whose looks worse, the question sat there between them. Jack breathed. Set up another session with Phillips, he said finally. Already texted him, Carter said. The deposition happened on a Thursday. Larissa went in first. She'd been preparing with Rebecca for 2 weeks, not rehearsing answers because Rebecca didn't do that, but learning how to stay in her body when the questions got hard, how to say, I don't know when she didn't know, and I don't remember exactly when she didn't remember exactly, and how to resist the specific pull of wanting to over-explain, to justify, to make herself more credible by saying more than was necessary. Diana, her counselor, had given her a single instruction before she went in. Remember that the truth doesn't need decoration. Say it plain. Plain is powerful. Jack waited in the hallway outside the conference room for 3 hours. He was not good at waiting. Phillips had told him that waiting was itself a practice, that the ability to be still while things happened around you was a skill like any other built through repetition, and that he had, in the 6 weeks since that first appointment, become meaningfully better at it, even if it didn't feel that way. Jack hadn't believed him at the time. He believed him a little more now, sitting in a hallway chair, breathing deliberately, watching the clock. Carter sat beside him and read something on his phone and said nothing, which was exactly right. At one point, Jack's phone buzzed. A club brother, different one from before. Heard things are moving. We got your back however you need. Followed by another text 10 minutes later from the road captain himself. Say the word or don't. Either way, we're here. Jack stared at the messages for a long time. Then he typed back, I know. Thank you. I've got it handled. And then, because it was true and because he was trying to be more honest than he used to be, the right way this time, he didn't know what response he expected. What he got was a single word: respect. He put the phone back in his pocket and looked at the ceiling and thought that maybe the world was more capable of surprise than he'd given it credit for. When Larissa came out of the conference room, she looked like someone who had run a long race, hollowed out, a little shaky but upright. Rebecca was behind her, and Rebecca's expression was the closest thing to satisfied that Jack had ever seen on her face, which was not very close to satisfied at all, but was notably different from her baseline. How'd it go? Jack said. Larissa sat down in the chair next to him and put her head back against the wall and closed her eyes for about 5 seconds. Then she opened them. He had a lawyer in there who who spent 45 minutes trying to get me to say I'd provoked it. Different ways, different angles, but that's what every question was really asking. She paused. I didn't. I know you didn't. I almost did, once. She looked at the ceiling. There was this question about whether I'd been drinking that night, and I started to answer it in this way, where I was already explaining, already defending, and Rebecca put her hand on my arm and I stopped. She looked at Jack. She just put her hand on my arm and I remembered plain as powerful. So I said I had 1 glass of wine with dinner. That's it. And I stopped talking. That's good, Jack said. That's exactly right. It doesn't feel like enough, she said. Sitting there and answering questions. After everything, it feels like, she searched for the word, like bringing a notepad to a gunfight. Rebecca's the gun, Carter said from the end of the row. Rebecca, standing a few feet away, reviewing her notes, said without looking up, Thank you, Mr. Webb. That's an image I'll carry with me. Carter's mouth twitched. Larissa looked at her lawyer. What happens now? Melissa deposes tomorrow. Dana the day after. Then we compile, we build the formal complaint, and we set a date. Rebecca finally looked up. I also received something this morning I want you all to hear. She set down her notepad. Grant Holloway contacted my office with a revised settlement offer, significantly higher than the first one. The hallway went very quiet. He's offering money to make this go away, Jack said. He's offering Larissa money, Rebecca said carefully. Melissa and Dana aren't part of this filing yet. They're supporting witnesses. This offer is directed at Larissa. She looked at Larissa directly. I want you to understand what it means when I tell you the number went up substantially. It means they've looked at what we have and they've decided the cost of fighting it may exceed the cost of settling. Or they've decided a settlement protects Tyler's record, Carter said. That too, Rebecca said. A settlement comes with a non-disclosure agreement. Tyler stays clean on paper. He can do this again. The silence in the hallway shifted into something heavier. Larissa was looking at her cast. The fracture had been healing well another 3 weeks and it would come off. Doctor had said, clean break, clean heal. She'd been told she might feel some stiffness in cold weather. A permanent reminder, small and occasional, of the night Tyler Reed had decided to teach her something. No, she said. Simple, flat, no performance in it. No settlement, she said. He doesn't get to buy his way to the next one. Jack looked at his sister, at the set of her jaw, at the particular quality of her stillness that had changed over these weeks from the stillness of someone frozen to the stillness of someone decided. Okay, Rebecca said. And for just a moment, something that was unambiguously real crossed her face. Not professional satisfaction, something warmer and less practiced. We go to court. The next twist came from a direction none of them had anticipated. Dana, the third woman, the one from Phoenix, had mentioned in her initial conversation with Rebecca that she'd kept emails. Not just texts, not just photos, but emails, because Tyler had been in the particular way of men who believe themselves too sophisticated for crude behavior, a communicator. Long, careful, articulate emails that had at the time read as passionate and attentive, and now read in the context of everything else as something else entirely. A record of a man constructing a version of a relationship that justified his behavior to himself in writing, which meant there was a paper trail of his psychology across 3 years and 2 women. Rebecca read them on a Saturday morning. She called Jack at 7 a.m., which she had never done before. I need you to understand something, she said without preamble. I've been practicing family law for 16 years. I have prosecuted abusers with more physical evidence than this and gotten acquittals. I have seen ironclad cases crumble because juries are human and humans are complicated. A pause. What Dana sent me last night changes the shape of this case fundamentally. These emails establish intent pattern and in 2 specific instances what appears to be deliberate planning before incidents that Melissa and Larissa both reported. Jack was standing in his kitchen, coffee untouched. He planned it, Jack said. I believe a jury will reach that conclusion, Rebecca said carefully. I don't use words like certain in this business. But I will tell you that Grant Holloway, when he sees these emails in discovery, is going to call his client and have a very different conversation than the one they've been having. After she hung up, Jack stood in the kitchen for a long time. He thought about a man sitting at a computer composing careful, articulate emails, constructing the architecture of control in clean sentences and paragraphs. He thought about Larissa reading those emails and feeling understood, feeling seen, not knowing she was reading the operational notes of her own undoing. The cold quality of it was something he hadn't fully felt until now. The rage he'd been managing all these weeks had been hot, immediate physical responsive. What moved through him now was different, colder. The understanding that Tyler Reed had never lost control, had never been swept up in a moment, had simply made choices consistently and deliberately over years. It should have made him feel better. It didn't. It made the whole thing more terrible in a way that he didn't know how to sit with. He called Phillips before he called Carter. That was new. 30 days ago, he wouldn't have known to do that. Phillips answered on the second ring. Jack talked. Phillips listened. At the end, Phillips said, "What does knowing this change for you?" "Nothing about the situation," Jack said. "Everything about how I understand it." "Say more." "I've been holding on to this idea that Tyler was—" Jack stopped, started again. "That it was rage, that he was like me in a way, that I understood the mechanism even if the target was wrong. But it wasn't rage, it was calculation. And I don't—" He pressed his hand flat on the kitchen counter. "I don't know what to do with a man I don't understand." "Why do you need to understand him?" The question stopped Jack completely. Because he didn't have a clean answer. "You've been trying to find something recognizable in Tyler Reed," Phillips said. "Something you can locate in your own experience, your own history. Because things you can locate, you can handle. But Tyler Reed is not your history, Jack. He's Larissa's. And your job was never to understand him. Your job was to protect her while other people who specialize in understanding people like him do their work." Jack leaned against the counter. "I've been making this about me," he said slowly. "Not a question." "A little," Phillips said, not unkindly, "which is human. You love your sister, and loving her means wanting to be the one who fixes it. But you've been doing something much harder and much more valuable than fixing it. You've been holding space for her to fix it herself. Do you understand the difference?" Jack was quiet for a moment. "Then when I was inside, he said, there was a guy, old-timer, done more time than anyone. He told me once that the strongest thing a man can do is make himself unnecessary. I didn't know what that meant then." He paused. "I think I'm starting to." Phillips said, "Hold on to that." Holloway called Rebecca the following Monday. Rebecca called Larissa. Larissa called Jack. Jack called Carter. It was the particular chain of communication of people who had become over 7 weeks of crisis and paperwork and therapy and late-night coffee on back steps, something that functioned like a unit. What Holloway had said translated out of legal language and into plain speech. The Reed family wanted to renegotiate, not a settlement this time, not an offer to make it go away. A conversation about what Tyler was willing to do: community service, mandatory counseling, a formal acknowledgement in exchange for the charges being reduced. "He wants a deal," Larissa said. She was on Jack's couch. Carter was in the corner chair. The dynamics of where everyone sat in this house had become fixed over the past weeks, assigned by habit. "Holloway's telling him he can't win," Carter said. "Can he?" Jack asked Rebecca, who was on speaker. "With what I have now, with the emails winning, is very difficult for him," Rebecca said. "A jury is never a guarantee, but Grant Holloway didn't build a 40-year career on losing cases he could have settled. He's telling Tyler to manage the damage." Larissa was quiet for a moment. She had the folder from the hospital advocate on the coffee table in front of her. Still there weeks later, the paper edges soft from handling. She'd read it front to back multiple times. Diana had told Jack once, in the early days, when Larissa was still figuring out whether what had happened to her was real, or whether she'd somehow constructed it. "What does Melissa think?" Larissa asked. "Rebecca, I spoke with her this morning. She said it's your call. She's here either way." "And Dana?" "Same." Larissa looked at her cast. 3 weeks away from coming off. The particular thing Tyler had made permanent, the stiffness in cold weather, the small, seasonal reminder, and she was looking at it not with the expression of someone haunted, but with the expression of someone taking inventory. "I want him to stand in a courtroom," she said. "I want what he did to be said out loud in a room where it can't be managed or settled or quietly agreed upon. I want a record." She looked up. "Not for me, for the next one." The room held that. "Larissa," Jack started. "I know it's risky," she said. "I know Holloway's going to come at me hard. I know it's going to take longer and cost more. and be genuinely awful in ways I can't fully prepare for. She met his eyes. I also know that I had pictures on my phone for 8 months because some part of me was already preparing. I didn't know what for, I do now. Jack looked at his sister, at the woman who had called him sobbing at 2 in the morning 7 weeks ago, barely able to form sentences, and who was now sitting on his couch in the middle of a legal battle she'd chosen to wage clear-eyed and deliberate and more fully herself than he'd seen her in years. He thought about what Phillips had said, about making yourself unnecessary. "Rebecca," he said, "you heard her." "I heard her," Rebecca said. "We go to trial." After the call ended, the three of them sat in the living room in the specific quiet that follows a decision that can't be undone. Then Carter said very quietly to Larissa, "I want you to know something." She looked at him. "Whatever this costs," he said, "and however long it takes, I'm not going anywhere." It was a plain sentence, no performance in it. Carter Webb had never in Jack's memory said anything for effect. Everything he said was just the truth arriving in whatever form it arrived in. Larissa looked at him for a moment. Something passed through her face, complicated and real, and not yet fully named. "I know," she said. "I know you're not." And Jack Morrison, the man they called the Beast, who had spent 15 years being the loudest and most dangerous thing in every room he entered, sat in his own living room and understood that the most important things that had happened in this house over the past 7 weeks had happened without him doing anything. They had happened because he had chosen over and over to hold the door. And the door had held. And on the other side of it, his sister had become someone she hadn't been before, someone she might never have become if he'd done what every instinct told him to do on that highway at 2 in the morning. Outside, the Arizona sun was setting again. Day 49 since the call. Tomorrow, Rebecca Torres would formally notify the court that the defendant's offer had been declined and the prosecution intended to proceed. Tyler Reed's careful, constructed world was about to meet 12 people who hadn't been part of his planning, and 3 women who had survived him were going to walk into that courtroom and say so. The trial date was set for a Wednesday in March. Rebecca had warned them it would feel anticlimactic at first, the formal scheduling, the procedural language, the calendar notation that reduced everything that had happened to a case number in a courtroom assignment. She was right. Jack heard the date and felt nothing dramatic. Just a quiet settling, like a door finally closing on a room that had been open too long. Larissa's cast came off 2 weeks before the trial. She sat in the orthopedist's office while the technician cut it away, and she looked at her arm underneath, thinner than the other one, pale where the cast had been, the skin strange and new feeling, and she pressed her fingers carefully along the place where the fracture had been. A clean line healed. The doctor said she'd regain full strength with some physical therapy. Said the cold weather stiffness might ease over time, or might not, that bodies were individual in what they remembered. She thanked him and walked out into the parking lot where Jack was waiting, and she held up her arm in the sun and looked at it and said nothing for a long moment. "How does it feel?" Jack asked. "Light," she said. "It feels light." He nodded. She put her arm down and they walked to the truck, and that was all that needed to be said about that. That evening, she called Diana and they talked for an hour. When she came out of the spare bedroom, her eyes were red, but her face was settled the way it got after the sessions. That cost her something, the one she came out of smaller and then somehow larger. She sat at the kitchen table where Jack was going over some paperwork, and she said, "Diana asked me today what I'm most afraid of, about the trial." Jack looked up. "What did you say?" "That I'm afraid of not being believed." She said it plainly, the way she'd learned to say true things without apology and without drama. "That I'm afraid of sitting in that room and saying everything and having 12 strangers decide it wasn't enough." "And what did Diana say?" Larissa looked at her arm. "She said that being believed matters. She didn't try to tell me it doesn't, but she said that I have already been believed by you, by Carter, by Rebecca, by Melissa and Dana, by every person who has heard what happened and understood what it was, and that the jury is one room. It's not the only room." She paused. "I've been thinking about that." Jack reached across the table and put his hand over hers, the right one, the healed one. "You're going to be believed on," he said. She looked at him. "You don't know that." "No," he said, "but I know you, and I know what the truth sounds like coming out of your mouth. And so will they." She turned her hand over and squeezed his once, then let go and pulled the paperwork toward her. "What are you working on?" Rebecca wants a written account of the night Tyler showed up at the house. Detailed. Everything I said, everything he said, the order of it. The recording wasn't enough. The recording is primary. This is corroborating. She wants the jury to have it in writing and hear it on tape. He paused. She said the moment where he accused you of manipulating me is particularly useful because it's the same language, the same framing that shows up in the emails he sent Dana. Same vocabulary, same rhetorical move. She's going to show the jury that Tyler Reed tells the same story about every woman who holds him accountable. Larissa was quiet for a moment. He really believed it, she said slowly. That's what I keep coming back to. He wasn't lying when he said those things to me. He actually believed I was the problem. He'd built this whole internal story where everything he did was a response to something I'd done wrong. She shook her head. Diana says that's the most dangerous kind, the kind who's convinced themselves. Philip says the same thing, Jack said, about a different kind of man. He looked at the paperwork. Me, actually. Not the same as Tyler, different entirely, but the part about building a story about yourself that justifies the things you do. He was quiet for a moment. I had a story too, just a different one. Larissa looked at her brother. What was yours? She asked. He thought about it honestly, that I was the protection, that my being dangerous kept people safe, that the violence was in service of something. A pause. It wasn't entirely wrong, but it wasn't entirely right either, and I'd stopped being able to tell the difference. She nodded slowly. Do you miss it? Every day, he said simply, which is why I keep going back to Phillips. The morning the trial began, Jack woke at 4 a.m. and lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and let all of it move through him. The rage that was still there, quieter now, but not gone. The fear for his sister, the particular helplessness of a man who was about to sit in a courtroom and watch other people fight a battle he'd spent his whole life insisting was his to fight. He didn't try to suppress any of it. That was the practice. Feel it, name it, don't become it. He was in the kitchen making coffee when Larissa came out of the spare room at 5:30. She was already dressed, hair done, the careful preparation of someone who understood that how you walk into a room tells that room something before you've said a word. She looked at him and he looked at her, and neither of them said anything for a moment. Then she said, I need you to promise me something. Yeah, whatever happens in there, whatever Holloway says, whatever Tyler's face does, whatever any of it looks like, you stay in your seat. Jack held her gaze. I know. I'm not asking if you know. I'm asking you to promise me. I promise, he said. I'm going to sit in that seat, and I'm going to watch, and I'm not going to move. She studied him the way she'd been studying him since she was 6 years old and could already read him better than most adults. Then she nodded. Okay, she said. Pour me some coffee. Grant Holloway was exactly what Jack had expected, and also somehow worse. He was polished in the way of a man who had done this so many times the polish had become involuntary. The precisely calibrated friendliness, the measured gravity, the suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent. He moved through the courtroom like it was his living room, and Jack watched him and understood with a cold clarity that this man had spent 40 years in rooms exactly like this one, and that familiarity was itself a weapon. Rebecca was not polished. She was precise. There was a difference. Polish was surface. Rebecca was structure all the way down, the kind of preparation that doesn't need presentation, because the thing itself is sound. Jack watched the jury during opening statements. 12 people he'd looked at them during selection, tried to read them, realized he didn't know how to read people in this context, that the skills that told him who to trust in a bar or on a highway were not the skills that applied here. He let that go. He trusted Rebecca. Holloway's opening was exactly what Rebecca had predicted. Measured sympathy for Larissa's pain. He was too experienced to dismiss it, followed by a careful reframing. Not that the incidents hadn't happened, but that they were being interpreted through a particular lens, a lens shaped by a difficult family situation, by a sister whose protective older brother had a documented history of violence, by the specific emotional aftermath of a relationship ending badly. Jack felt Larissa's hand tighten on the arm of her chair. He stayed in his seat. When Rebecca stood, she said 4 sentences before she showed the jury anything. She said, Tyler Reed is a deliberate man. He is careful, articulate, and intelligent. These are not character defenses. These are the reasons the harm he caused took so long to surface. Then she played 45 seconds of the recording from Jack's doorstep, Tyler's voice, calm and reasonable and certain, telling Jack that Larissa was manipulating him. And then she put the first email on the screen. Written to Dana 3 years prior using almost identical language about the woman he was with at the time. The same words, the same framing, the same story told twice to two different women years apart. The courtroom was very quiet. Jack watched the jury watch the screen, watched the specific quality of attention that 12 people give something when it has arrived at them with the full weight of truth. He breathed. Larissa testified on the second day. She walked to the stand with the deliberateness of someone who has rehearsed not the words, but the state, the internal condition from which the words would come. Jack watched her sit down, watched her adjust the microphone, watched her look at Rebecca and then at the jury, with the expression of someone who has made a decision about this moment and is committed to it. Rebecca took her through it chronologically. Not dramatically, just clearly. Each incident, each date where she had one, each photograph, each ERR record. The narrative of 18 months laid out in sequence, the way patterns only become visible when you can see the whole shape of them. Larissa's voice broke once during the description of the night itself. The sound, the pop of the fracture, the stillness that came after. This is what happens. She stopped for about 4 seconds and the courtroom held very still, and then she steadied herself and kept going. Jack's hands were on his knees, pressing down. Holloway's cross-examination lasted 3 hours. It was in its way at a kind of violence, bloodless and procedural, and entirely within the rules of the room, but violence nonetheless. He questioned timelines. He questioned why she hadn't reported earlier incidents. He asked in carefully worded ways about her relationship with her brother, about Jack's history, about whether she'd ever heard Jack make threats. And Larissa, who had learned from Diana that plain is powerful, who had spent 7 weeks rebuilding herself into someone who could do this, answered every single question without ornament and without retreat. Did you provoke Tyler Reed on the night in question? No. Were you aware that your brother had a history of violent confrontations prior to? My brother wasn't in the room, she said. Tyler Reed was. A murmur moved through the gallery. Holloway shifted. Ms. Morrison, I'm simply trying to establish. I know what you're trying to establish, she said. Quiet, even. You're trying to make the story about my brother so it doesn't have to be about your client. But my brother didn't break my arm, Tyler Reed did. Rebecca didn't smile, but Jack, watching from his seat, saw her hand move to her pen and tap it once on the legal pad. A private punctuation. Holloway moved on, but the jury had heard it. Melissa testified this following morning. Dana testified in the afternoon. The emails came in through Dana's testimony, 37 of them entered into evidence. The paper trail of a man documenting his own behavior in the clean, self-justifying language of someone who had never once imagined accountability. Dana read 2 of them aloud at Rebecca's request, her voice steady and entirely without emotion, which was more devastating than emotion would have been. That night, Holloway and Grant Reed Sr. and Tyler himself were in a conference room together for 4 hours. Rebecca knew because her contact in the building texted her. She called Jack at 9 p.m. He's going to make a move tomorrow, she said. I don't know what form it takes, but 4 hours means they're not happy with where this is going. Do we need to do anything? Get some sleep, she said. All of you. Jack relayed this to Larissa and Carter. Larissa went to bed. Carter went home. Jack sat up until midnight doing what he always did when he couldn't sleep. Not writing, not anymore. Just sitting at the kitchen table with cold coffee in the quiet which had become in recent months less oppressive and more simply what was there. He thought about Tyler Reed in a conference room, about the Reed family's money meeting a reality it couldn't purchase its way out of, about 37 emails and 3 women and a broken radius in the long, slow machinery of accountability grinding forward. He thought about the beast. It was still there. It would always be there, Phillips had been clear about, that had said early on that the goal was never elimination, but integration. That the energy which had made Jack Morrison dangerous for 15 years was the same energy that had driven him to that hospital at 5 a.m. and kept him in his seat through 3 hours of Holloway's cross-examination and called Phillips at 7 a.m. when the news about the emails hit. The beast was not the enemy. The beast was the material. What mattered was what you built with it. He thought he was beginning to understand what to build. The twist came at 10:15 the next morning. Not from Holloway, from Tyler himself. He stood up during a procedural recess, stood up in the middle of the courtroom before Holloway could stop him, before anyone quite understood what was happening, and he said in the controlled, articulate voice of a man who had decided to reassert his own narrative, "I want to make a statement." The judge's expression did something complicated. "Mr. Reed, your counsel." "I understand," Tyler said. "I want to make a statement." What followed was 4 minutes that Rebecca would later describe with characteristic understatement as a significant gift. Tyler spoke about the relationship, about Larissa, about his genuine feelings, his real care, the ways he believed he'd tried to give her something she hadn't had. He spoke about the night of the incident, acknowledging it finally for the first time, but in the language of his own story, an accident, a moment that had been blown far out of proportion by people with agendas, by a brother with a history of violence who had turned his sister against him, by a legal system being weaponized by. Rebecca was on her feet, but the damage was done, not to Larissa's case, to Tyler's, because what Tyler Reed had just done in front of a jury that had already seen 37 emails and heard 3 women and watched a recording of him appearing at a protective order location was confirm every single thing Rebecca had told them about how he thought. The same language, the same framing, the same story. Performed live without editing under pressure. Jack heard it from his seat and felt something move through him that wasn't rage and wasn't relief and wasn't triumph. It was something quieter and more complicated than any of those. It was the recognition that Tyler Reed had, in the end, been unable to help himself. That the controlling personality had at the last moment seized the controls and driven directly into the thing it was trying to avoid. He looked at Larissa. She was looking at Tyler. Her face was still, her hands were loose in her lap, and in her eyes was something Jack hadn't seen there in a very long time, something clear and unclouded and entirely her own. She was not afraid. She was done being afraid. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. They came back on a Friday afternoon with a verdict on all 3 counts: guilty of domestic battery causing injury, guilty of aggravated harassment, guilty of violation of a protective order. Tyler Reed stood and heard the word 3 times, and each time his face did something small, and recalibrating the expression of a man whose internal story was being forcibly rewritten by external reality. Holloway put his hand on his client's arm. Tyler didn't move. Larissa sat very still beside Rebecca and listened to all 3 verdicts, and then she folded her hands in her lap and looked at them and breathed. Jack was 2 rows behind her. When the 3rd verdict landed, he put his hand on her shoulder, and she reached up and covered it with hers without turning around. Melissa was in the gallery. Dana was in the gallery. They found each other's eyes when the 3rd verdict came in and held that look for a long moment, 2 strangers bound by the particular intimacy of shared survival. Jack thought this is what accountability looks like. Not clean, not fast, not satisfying in the way he'd always imagined satisfaction would feel, but real, undeniable. Something that had existed in the record of the world now permanently, whatever came after. Tyler Reed was sentenced 6 weeks later. 32 months in state prison, mandatory counseling, and a civil protection order that would follow him for 10 years upon release. His father's statement to the press spoke about cooperation and reflection and the family's commitment to understanding. Rebecca read it aloud to them in her office with the particular expressionless delivery she used when she wanted to say something without saying it. Larissa said, "He'll be fine, you know. His father has money and he's smart and he'll tell the right story to the right people. And in a few years, he'll be fine." She paused. "But it's on the record. Whatever story he tells, it's on the record now." "Yes," Rebecca said, "it is." 1 year later, summer came back to Arizona the way it always did, without apology. Full and relentless, the heat arriving in waves that bent the air above the asphalt. Jack's backyard was strung with lights Carter had put up the evening before, and there were folding tables and food, and the sound of people talking and laughing. The particular sound of a gathering where everyone is genuinely glad to be there. Larissa was barefoot in the grass. She'd started yoga 8 months ago, and she moved differently now. Not carefully, not defensively, but with the ease of someone who had relearned that their body was their own. She was talking to Melissa, who had driven down again this time, without the armor composure this time, with something that looked remarkably like ease. Dana was there too, laughing at something Carter had said, and the particular sight of three women who had been brought together by the worst thing that had happened to any of them, standing in a backyard laughing, was something Jack couldn't quite look at directly without something happening behind his sternum. A road brother showed up mid-afternoon, one of three who came, which was not nothing, the club's version of a peace offering, or maybe just of respect. They shook Jack's hand and looked around and didn't say much about the decorations or the yoga mats visible through the back window or the therapeutic workbooks on the kitchen table, which Jack appreciated. Not everything needed to be discussed. Carter found him standing at the edge of the yard looking at the gathering. "You all right?" Carter said. "Yeah," Jack said, and meant it. "I keep trying to find the word for what this is and I can't." "What it feels like," Carter offered. "No, what it is. What this specific thing is, this version of the day." He looked at his sister, laughing. "I spent so long being sure that safety was something I created by being dangerous, by being the thing that other things were afraid of." He was quiet for a moment. "I didn't know it could look like this." Carter was quiet beside him. "She's happy," Carter said simply. Looking at Larissa, "She's getting there," Jack said, "which is better, actually. Happy can be a performance. Getting there is real." Carter smiled. "That sounds like something Phillips would say." "He did say it about 6 weeks ago." Jack almost smiled. "I've been saving it." Carter looked at Larissa for another moment. Something in his face that Jack recognized now had been recognizing for months, the specific quality of attention a man pays to someone when he's stopped pretending he's just a friend. "You gonna say something to her?" Jack said. Carter looked at him. "Not today," Carter said. "She doesn't need today to be about that." "Tomorrow," Carter thought about it. "When she's ready." Jack nodded. "For what it's worth," he said. "You are the only person I've ever met that I'd trust with her." Carter said nothing, but the thing in his face said enough. Later, when the gathering had wound down and the lights were still up, and most people had gone and it was just the four of them, Jack, Larissa, Carter, Melissa, who had stopped being a stranger somewhere around the third month of phone calls and had become something harder to categorize and more valuable. They sat outside and let the night come in around them. Larissa leaned her head back and looked at the stars and said out of nowhere the way she said things now, just placing them in the air because they were true, and truth didn't need a setup. "I used to think about what would have happened if I hadn't called you that night, if I just toughed it out, handled it, the way he said I should always handle things, without making them into a big deal." Nobody said anything. "I think I'd have disappeared," she said. Quiet, certain. "Not all at once, slowly, just less of me every year until there wasn't enough left to call anyone." She was still looking at the stars. "That's what the pattern is for. That's what the isolation is for. You can't call for help if you've forgotten you're allowed to need it." Jack looked at her. "You called," he said. She turned her head to look at him. "You answered." It was simple. It was the whole story, and it was simple. A phone call in the dark, a man on a highway, a friend who blocked a lane at 90 miles an hour because he loved his friend more than his friend's rage. A lawyer who didn't need you to have money, just a case. Two women who drove hours to sit in rooms and say hard, true things out loud. A therapist who asked hard questions without judgment. A process that felt too slow and too legal and turned out to be exactly enough. And a man who had spent 15 years being the beast and had learned late hard at the cost of considerable personal comfort that the bravest thing he would ever do was nothing, was sitting in a seat, was holding a door, was letting the people he loved fight their own battles while he made himself into the kind of man who deserved to stand beside them when they won. Jack Morrison looked at his sister under the Arizona stars 1 year out from a 2 a.m. phone call that had changed everything, and understood that this unremarkable and ordinary and full of people, laughing and food going cold and lights strung by hand across a backyard, this was what he had protected on her for, not vengeance, not the satisfaction of having been the most dangerous thing in the room. This, he didn't have a word for it. He didn't need one. The beast was quiet, and the man it had always been standing in front of, patient, present, and finally free, was exactly where he was supposed to be.